Welcome, everyone, to Truth, Politics, and the Press. This evening is a collaboration between the Center for Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy and the College of Media, Communication, and Information. My name is Pete Simonson. I'm the chair of the Department of Communication, and I'm a fellow this year with the Center for Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy. I'd like to thank the Center for Western Civ, Bob Pasnow and Alex Holmgren for all that they've done. Thank the College of Media, Communication, and Information, Dean Lori Bergen, Melinda Miller, Professor Liz Skews, and I'd like to thank all of you all for braving the cold weather and coming out for what I know is going to be an exciting and lively discussion about some quite pressing issues of our moment. The theme this year for the Center for Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy is rhetoric and truth. And a lot of times those are thought of as opposites. We have truth on the one hand, we have rhetoric on the other. Those of us who study and do scholarship on rhetoric know there's also a longer tradition that goes back to Aristotle that sees rhetoric as an art of civic discourse. An art of civic discourse that would be used by citizens and leaders and that we use to approximate truth as best we can to deliberate about what's true, what's right, what's good, and to make decisions together. So there's a way in which this tradition of rhetoric, which has been a tradition of civic discourse for citizens, has in the modern era got offloaded or helped through journalism, through the press. That is, the press has traditionally been that which shines light, which helps citizens to deliberate, which helps shine light on the truth of the matter and hold our elected officials in check. There's clearly been a number of different kinds of press in the U.S. To take just two examples, in the 19th century, the press and newspapers were organized around parties, and the idea was that a partisan press was the kind that fit and tied in with the political culture of the day. In the 20th century, the 1920s and 30s, a newer and to us more familiar kind of press came out based on a more professional standard, based on not partisanship but fair-mindedness, laying out a contested ideal of objectivity and ways to generate facts and truth out of that. In our own day, as I think we all know, politics, truth, the press are all problematic in different ways. Politicians, like people in general, have always lied. It seems as though politicians may or may not be able to lie with impunity now. The press has always had its critics. Every press has had its critics. But now it seems that there's wider spread distrust, questions about the mainstream press, the traditional press, new forms of press, new forms of journalism. So what do we do with that? This panel, I'm delighted to say, is part of the Center for Western Civilization, Thought, and Policy's Dialogue Series, the Western Civilization Dialogue Series. And dialogue is indeed one of the most important parts of a free society. Dialogue from multiple perspectives, dialogue that's free and open, dialogue that'll occur among our three esteemed panelists, but that we also want to extend to those of you who are here tonight. So the plan will be to run a little bit of a moderated discussion up here with me asking some questions at the start, and then we'll move into question and answer from the floor. So really want this to be a civic engagement in its own right. In let me lay out a couple of questions, kind of bigger questions that I'd like us to consider in some way tonight. Does truth matter in contemporary politics? Does the press and different forms of news media play a significant role in helping us to achieve that goal? If so, what are they? What are the problems with our civic discourse? How are they tied to problems with our news media, tied to problems with our political culture, tied to problems with our leaders? Our panelists, in alphabetical order, beginning in the middle, Kelsey Harkness. Kelsey is senior writer and editor at the Daily Signal, the conservative political journalism website published by the Heritage Foundation. Kelsey does on-campus interviews, podcasts, documentaries, investigative reporting, and commentary on immigration, education, the economy, and conservative feminism, among many other issues. She's the host of the weekly podcast Problematic Women and is a regular contributor to The Federalist, to Fox News, and to Fox Business. Kelsey is also a visiting fellow at the Independent Women's Forum and is a senior fellow at the Steamboat Institute. Kelsey, thanks for being here. Next, on the far end, Professor Rod Hart holds the Shivers Chair in Communication and is also professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin. An expert on media and politics, he's the author or editor of 15 books, including Seducing America, How Television Charms the Modern Voter, and most recently, Civic Hope, How Ordinary Americans Keep Democracy Alive. Rod told me that he has just in the last week finished another new book on the Trump presidency as well. So studies presidential rhetoric, presidential communication from a number of different perspectives. Rod is also founding director of the Annette Strauss Institute for Civic Life, former dean of the University of Texas's Moody College of Communication, and the recipient of numerous awards for his works in the fields of political science and communication study. Welcome, Rod. And our third panelist is Amy Westfeldt, managing editor of NewsGuard. And if you don't know about NewsGuard, it is really fabulous. NewsGuard is an online service designed to address the fake news crisis by using trained journalists as analysts to review and rate more than 7,500, and probably the number is growing, this is what I got recently, news and information sites that are widely accessed and circulated in the US. So there's a plug-in browser that you can get, and then as soon as you click on a link or a news site, link on social media, it'll give you a score for that news site with 9 different criteria that Amy can speak into for us. Before taking over at NewsGuard, Amy worked for 25 years as an editor and reporter at the Associated Press, directing their New York City bureau and serving as news manager for the global coordination hub known as AP's Nerve Center. In partnership with Facebook, she produced AP's first fact checks of false claims in published news stories just after the 2016 election and founded the Not Real News fixture of AP, a weekly roundup of viral, untrue claims circulating online. Welcome, Amy. So I'd like to, and I'll sit down now and try to get out of the way, but I'd like to start with a big question for each of you and have each of you answer it in the way that you would from the work that you're doing now in NewsGuard, as a working journalist and as a professor. Does truth matter in politics and civic discourse, and what role do you think news media play in that? You can break that down into 1 or 2 questions. Who'd like to start us on that? The professor always starts.
Well, they all looked in this direction. I think it's...
Let the veteran begin.
You know, it's a great question, not easily answered. One of the things I think is true is that there are more than enough facts around. People, you know, the statement is sometimes made, well, you know, you have a right to speak, but you don't have the right to your own facts. And I think that's completely wrong. Everybody's got facts. It's how we reason about the facts that we've got. And that's what politics is about. You're paying X number of dollars for your mortgage to the city based on how much your house is worth. And that's a fact. How do you feel about it? Well, compared to other places, not so bad. Well, it's terrible. I mean, so we all have facts. It's getting to have some kind of understanding about what we're going to do about the facts that we've got. And so I guess in a lot of ways, I think, unlike some, I think this is a buoyant time for journalism and a buoyant time for politics, because there's more facts than we've ever had available. And there's more people in the United States that care about the facts and the interpretation of those facts that's ever been true before. 2016, in my opinion, was a great election. It got people to come out to vote that had not voted before. 2018 was also a great election. It got a whole bunch of people out angry about what had happened in 2016. So maybe because I write a book called Civic Hope, I'm a bit of a Pollyanna. But I do think that truth is what it always has been, a dialogue about what we're going to do about the fact world that we live in. And to me, this is one of the high points of American politics. As nasty as it is, I think it's a time for us to celebrate the fact that we've got a democracy, that people care enough to get involved. And I think it's also a good moment for journalism. Journalists care about the facts. They interpret them their way. And so I think truth's important. I think politics is even more vital than it ever has been.
Thank you. And is this working? Good.
Is it flipped on there?
It's better? Oh, here we go. All right. To piggy off of that, I went to school at Lafayette College, and I got interested in communications and journalism, and became passionate about finding a different way to communicate policy issues to the American public, because I walked around my library doing student projects asking my friends and fellow classmates to identify Afghanistan on a map, and they couldn't do it. And I found that really disappointing. And as much as I wanted to blame them, I blame the media for failing in their role to educate younger generations on what's happening both domestically and globally. Now I'm in an interesting position 10 years later, because I'm wondering, do I regret that? Because we see so many people jump to conclusions without fully looking at the historical facts and giving context to whatever the situation that it is that we're discussing. I think that frustrates a lot of journalists. I think there's, of course, truth matters. There's different kinds of truths. There's truths in the perspective you're coming from, the experiences that you've had, and the beliefs that you hold. Those are all truths. No one can deny that truth to you. And then there are, of course, factual truths. But even these factual truths are very difficult to figure out. What facts as a journalist do I cite? So I work at the Heritage Foundation. I'm in a new media landscape. We can get into that a bit more later. I'm in an interesting position where the Heritage Foundation is coming out with their own studies, their own facts, and there are activist groups on the left coming out with their own facts that contradict that. And so, if you're a mainstream journalist at the AP, who do you go with, the Heritage Foundation or the Center for American Progress? I think, in a way, journalist jobs is very difficult right now because we are in an information overload. It can be overwhelming, especially for young journalists, which many of us are, because it is a burnout industry and not everyone can stay in it very long like yourself. So I think it takes a lot of education, and I think we would all be in a better position if we recognize the different truths and the different facts that are coming both from our own experiences and from prestigious institutions that do have a lot of accountability and can't put out fake facts.
Hello? Got it. I agree completely. There are many, many truths. Truth matters in life and in politics. And we are living in an extraordinary time where people have completely different views of what the truth is. That's also true in our politics. And just as Kelsey said, this is where we need to see which facts matter to us and how facts are used to present particular points of view. Where we are coming at this right now from as NewsGuard is we are not trying to decide on what your particular truth is, what your life's perspective is. We are looking at information and facts that can be as objectively reported as possible, and yet there's the Heritage Foundation study and the Center for American Progress study, which will present perhaps a different take on unemployment or poverty, and then I think we are in a position where we are better off hearing from both points of view. So you can get that information, be informed, and come up with your particular truth. I also think this is an incredible time for journalism, and not only for reporting what actually is happening, but there's an entire industry now involved with reporting what did not happen and trying to, be beyond just trying to decide what a politician is saying and why. We now have to figure out where the misinformation was coming from, in which country, and where and why, and that's the fact checking departments at every major newspaper at the AP have multiplied enormously. That's a huge industry, and just looking at the way we get our truth and our information, how widespread it is, makes this a very challenging and fascinating time. We're also living in a world where the way the information is coming to us is constant, mostly electronic, mostly on social media. My colleague Bob Pasnow and I, my friend from college, we put out the college paper many years ago, and that was an actual newspaper where you just picked it up and read it, and there was no other source. And now, where are you getting your information? On your phone, in a Google search, on Facebook, different headlines, maybe 3 different headlines for every piece of information, and so that all has to be that you have to discern what's true and how it's been presented and what the motive is for who is presenting it.
I want to return to the new media landscape for information and news in a moment, but after starting out kind of big and philosophical, let me lay out an example. State of the Union address occurred earlier this week, and one of the claims that the president made was that there is a crisis on our southern border. The next day, the Washington Post, part of the mainstream media that I know, Kelsey, you've had your unhappiness with at times, ran a fact check, 30 claims, and ran a fact check. And one of the claims that they fact checked was that there's a crisis on the southern border. They answered, by any objective standard, there is no new crisis, that was the word they used, on the southern border. And then they brought out statistics with the number of immigration and so forth. So my question for all of you, Amy is somebody who's in the broadly fact-checking business. Kelsey is somebody who has been critical of the mainstream media. And Rod is somebody who believes that everybody's got their own facts. Is that a proper use of the Washington Post fact check to make a claim about there not being a crisis on the southern border? And is that the kind of thing that we should be concerned about, the accuracy of such a claim?
I have one quick question for context before we all answer. You said the Washington Post fact-checked this and said there's no new crisis on the southern border. Did President Trump say there is a new crisis, or did he say there is a crisis on the southern border? Yeah,
so that was the slippage. But then they went on to move out more broadly into what would count as a crisis, and comparatively with regard to 10 years ago in numbers and now. So, yeah.
I I think Amy is more the expert on this, but that is my initial reaction to that. What did Trump actually say, and what did the fact checkers say? Because I agree, this isn't a new crisis, and in a way, doesn't that make it a worse crisis that we've been dealing with a crisis on the southern border for decades now, and we still haven't solved it? So yes, I would take issue with that particular fact check if that's the way they framed it, and be happy to get into a whole debate about border walls and so forth, but I think Amy would have good perspective on the fact checking.
I mean, crisis, it's a political word. It's almost an opinionated word, and I think I would want more detail about exactly what was described. That's a hard claim to fact check, because there's something going on, and we've seen pictures of it, we have some evidence of it, but crisis seems like that's rhetoric. That seems like a political way to describe it, and not maybe that wouldn't be my best choice for how to fact check something. There have been a lot. We at NewsGuard have been looking at coverage of the caravan, which has been described in a number of different ways, and there are different ways. There are different studies that are cited. Sometimes there's a phrase calling "storm the border." "Storm the border" has been a phrase that I think maybe goes much farther factually than crisis, which seems a little bit of an opinion. But this is it's interesting. So, that's all I have.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's nonsense. A crisis is what you see. I have 5 granddaughters, and I can tell you that depending upon how things work out at lunch, it's either a great day or a crisis. Well, she wouldn't sit with me today. Well, why not? Oh, well, she sat with Ginny instead. So I think there's a lot of silliness in journalism because of Donald Trump today, and I think there's a lot of brilliant journalism being practiced as well. But he has brought out both the silliness and some really wonderful reporting. He is such a goad to to journalists. The man does not respect language. Journalists love language. The facts that he's got in the moment are the facts that he runs with, and sometimes he has to invent them. There's nothing more offensive to a working journalist. So the Trump administration, Donald Trump, the person, has changed so much of all things, and he's causing this conversation to be had, which I think is wonderful. That we ought to be having exactly this kind of conversation. Which facts do you like? How, where did they come from? What do they mean? Ultimately, journalism, rhetoric is all about interpreting the world and drawing a conclusion about it and saying, where should we go from here? That's what civic discourse is about. Journalism is central to that. And Donald Trump has been a disaster and a wonderment all at the same time.
A disruptor. And just to give you some perspective on how crazy some of the fact checkers have got lately, when President Trump hosted, I believe it was the Clemson basketball team, am I correct? When he hosted them in the White House during the government shutdown, the chefs were not available because they were not getting paid, so he ordered a bunch of fast food. I'm sure you all saw that. I thought it was a pretty amazing picture. Washington Post seriously fact-checked President Trump on claiming that he had burgers mile high in the White House for these basketball players. And I just think that is insulting to the American public to think we need a fact check on that. The fact that these people are getting paid to do this, I think is really pathetic for the journalism industry. And I think it does us all a disservice. It's why so many of us don't take the fact checkers seriously anymore, when I believe in the past they did play an important role.
What do you think about that, Amy?
I didn't know about the burgers. I didn't know about that fact check. I don't think it was a mile. I think we were good with that.
But so do we take, I mean, is it fair to take a bad example, which is, do we fact check the hyperbole that the burgers were a mile high? Everybody knows that's not the case. And to say that there's a problem with the institution of mainstream media fact checking. And I guess this is like points to something that goes beyond just facts, but sort of tone, reasonableness in civic discourse and giving people some benefit of the doubt in the current landscape.
I think there's too much journalism that is written today before things have happened. You might have 10 reporters of the Washington Post queued up to cover the State of the Union address. And you look at the unanimity of opinion after the story has been written, and you just wonder if things haven't gone too far, that the story is written before the occurrence. And been spending a lot of time looking at relation between journalism and the Trump administration. That's why I've come to it, and it's a problem, and it's because he is so profoundly offensive to the very fundaments of what journalism has stood for in the past, and he continues to be. He has set up his own publishing industry. He has become the publisher-in-chief as well as the executive-in-chief, and he's canny in having done that, and he's brutal in his forcefulness as the publisher-in-chief. He hates the press and he loves the press with equal intensity. And so it's a marvelous time to be an American.
I mean, when our civic discourse today is really Twitter, where most of the activity goes on, when the White House staff in general, I don't think has ever been on call for tweets in the way that we have been in a White House staff, where you have to be on. It could be any hour, of the day where where news could happen, major news could happen, based on the president's tweets.
So that's a good segue back to the new media environment for journalism, information, civic discourse. What do you all see as the biggest challenges right now in working in the environment and thinking about the possibility of having a informed and profitable civic sphere through our media environment? You want to start with that, Kelsey?
Well, as a conservative journalist, I almost wish I didn't have to be that. I wish I could just be in the mainstream media. But very quickly when I came into this industry, I realized that the mainstream media needed to be called out and they needed to be held accountable. There's a whole industry now, there's a whole group of journalists whose full-time job it is to watch what the media says, because if we don't do it, nobody else will hold them accountable. I wish that the state of our media weren't so divided, where now we have conservative publications and liberal publications in the mainstream media, which I consider mostly liberal publications. I wish it didn't have to be like that, but just sit here and imagine the country right now if it weren't for conservative journalists pushing back on a lot of what you're hearing from the mainstream media. I think it's absolutely necessary that we all have jobs, pushing back on the narratives that you're seeing, pushing back on the fact checks. I think journalists under President Trump have gotten quite selfish in looking out for themselves. We've seen them starting to play victim. When they botched the Covington high school Catholic boy story, instead of apologizing, they played victim. They claimed they were getting attacked. Well, you just ruined this kid's life. This is attached to him forever. So I think the media is fractured. I think it's fueling tribalism, which is unfortunate, but I think it's a necessary evil. And that's why at the end of the day, I can sleep at night knowing that if I weren't there, I think the state of our media would would be in a really scary place, given what I see coming out of the mainstream media.
I'd like to make it, the term mainstream media and elite media, there's a lot of ways of, it seems to me that one of the things that is especially true today, the difference between print journalism and cable news. And it's, cable news is a very different world indeed. If you're in a kind of a perky, progressive, liberal mood tonight, you know what channel you're going to watch when you get home. I mean, you're not going to look at Fox because that's not going to keep that spirit going, right? And if you're a little bit down on things and think the government's taking too much of your money, you're going to turn on Fox. You're going to do that before you even take in the news. You're going to pick your news source and then run from there. And you're going to get all riled up because when your team is at bat, you're going to be yelling for them. And so I think that I'm much prouder of print journalists today than what passes for journalism, particularly in cable news. I think that distinction is terribly important and to be paid attention to by all citizens.
Yes, cable news is often oxygen for different, people who could see the same thing and have a completely different opinion. And so without talking about mainstream media or alternative, there's a wealth of information out there on social media, websites, video, podcasts, TV, and it's polarized. There are some businesses, some media, new media, or new entrepreneurs who have actually tried to appeal to this polarized state. At NewsGuard, we found a few companies where sites that are very conservative and very liberal are owned by the same company, and the idea perhaps is not about ideology, but it's about money, or about trying to often tell the same story just through a different lens, say running the same clip of, Nancy Pelosi gets roasted by Trump, or watch Nancy Pelosi take down Trump, and it could be perhaps the same clip. So this is sort of where we are, and that there might be a business reason for that the free press, which we need, I don't think we want censorship, provides this, and this is where we just sort of need to discern where we're at, and especially if they're bad actors that are, when I say bad actors, I mean a government or a country that is not what it claims to be presenting this.
In response to what you are drawing our attention to, Rod, and thinking about cable news on the one hand, print news on the other, how do you think about that, Kelsey, as somebody who operates on a number of different platforms at once? What do you think have the most potentials as you think about the quality of journalism on cable news versus what you can do at the Daily Signal, for instance? What's that like?
Well, I totally agree that cable news is probably not the most productive productive platform of discourse, but I also view it as another necessary evil in our industry, where if I believe in the work that I'm doing at the Daily Signal, where a lot of times I'm traveling and going to middle of nowhere Kentucky to talk to former coal miners who were promised money to learn how to code, and then promised jobs after, and those jobs didn't actually exist. If I go out there and tell their stories and nobody knows who I am, it's much harder for them to listen to me. If people recognize me and I have a presence on Twitter, which I also think is unhealthy, and I have a presence on TV, there's more of a chance that those stories that I really do care about will get out there. So I am always trying to find this balance with my time, with how much time do I devote to going on Fox News and how much time do I devote to really the reasons why I went into journalism, to tell these personal stories, to communicate how policies are affecting real people. And I'm very blessed to be able to do that at the Daily Signal. There's not many, we know most journalists now are either in New York City and DC, and I'm one of them, but I get to travel a lot and spend time in places that I never would have been and meet people who I never would have known and hear perspectives that I never would have heard. And I just don't think enough journalists leave their desks these days. So I'm actually very encouraged with where I see new media going. Podcasts are huge right now. They're growing. There's close to 1 million different podcasts now. And I think podcasts are such a high quality form of or provider of information. It's not just the conversations you hear on cable news. You're able to get far more in depth. I'm encouraged that millennials and Gen X, I can't keep track. But I'm encouraged that younger Americans are seeking out these products that do provide more in-depth, substantive conversations. And that's why even us at the Heritage Foundation are now producing podcasts as forms of communication while still trying to have a presence everywhere. So to tell you the truth, I feel very spread thin between trying to maintain a presence on all these platforms because we want to reach as many people as we can. And so now when I do the videos, videos are relatively new. Instead of just publishing them on a video, we'll also publish their stories on the podcast, and I'll also write about it. So we're trying to be there wherever people want to be to provide that more substantive conversation and discourse that I think a lot of people are missing and frustrated with when they turn on cable news.
Let me take a couple of more and then we'll open it up to everybody. But so Rod's book here, Civic Hope, looks at letters to the editor in 12 different mid-sized cities from the 1940s to 2010?
12.
And in that, we get a couple of kinds of things. We get one, citizen engagement with civic discourse, with the politics of the day, and people trying to keep alive American ideals and hopes. But the other thing we get is a picture of a certain kind of newspaper industry, and one that is threatened now. So after Rod making the opening claim that we're living in pretty good times politically and journalistically, and Kelsey, you work in both sides, but you also sounded a note of optimism with regard to podcasts and other new media. Let me weigh in with some pessimism. So here in Denver, in the last 6 months, the Denver Post, which is owned by an absentee owner, a hedge fund, cut its already small staff by another 50 journalists. And the Denver Post is the paper of record for our state. They have less and less local news, more and more things that they pick up from the national wires. They don't have, you talk about journalists being on the street, they don't have journalists to be on the street. And so it seems to me that we can talk about markets and reaching eyeballs of different kind. Are you in an upbeat mood or a downbeat mood, turning into cable news? We could talk about elite national news media and how they're doing some very good work right now. We could talk about the importance of conservative news media pushing back on the mainstream media. But the fact of the matter is we have less and less community news and local news that way. And that seems to me like a real crisis, and a crisis for politics and for truths that really matter to people. So how do you all think about that kind of nationalization and the threats to local journalism that are part of the business model for news?
It certainly is a problem. My optimism is not necessarily about the business model. It's about the opportunity for journalism to really make a difference, however it's going to be. And I don't think anyone knows what that's going to be. But I do believe that the people in the United States of America have never been better educated than they are today in their history. Educated people are going to want to continue to be educated. They're going to learn information. They're going to ultimately pay for information. Wall Street Journal is a very it's a pretty good investment if you're looking to invest in journalism, because people who are in the money business need to know the facts that they can trust to make their decisions. That's going to be true for all of us. Having said that, I don't know how that's going to happen, but I do know that people are going to want information they can trust, and somehow some configuration of forces is going to meet that demand. And we're in a moment of experimentation. There have never been more people employed to do communication work in the history of the world than there is today, in the history of the world. Now, the thing is that General Motors hires people to do communication work, right? And not just make cars. So in that sense, it's a halcyon day. The business model is still something in progress. But I think there'll be differentiation. The reason I am attracted to people who led us to the editor is that these people are not anonymous as they are on the web, and they live somewhere. They live in a place. And the way I know the world is changing, and we're in a postmodern world, but it seems to me that people are always going to live somewhere. And if you live somewhere, you're going to care about the things that are in your immediate contiguous space. And if that's true, you're going to care about potholes and the cost of childcare and where kids can go to school. And you will want to make decisions based on information that you've got. So the need is going to continue to be there. How it gets addressed, I think, is going to be there'll be 1,000 flowers blooming until we figure it out.
I'm sort of reminded of when I started my career at the AP, and we would send, I would go with my tape recorder, my pen, and my notebook, and a photographer would be there, and we'd have several people, maybe a second reporter would be there, and it was just such a different time for resourcing, which is what you're talking about, that covering locals. Today it would be me tweeting with a video camera, iPhone video, and you're doing it all, and technology is helping that, and that might be okay. It's not okay when people, it's never okay when people lose their jobs. But I have to say, in the work we've just been doing in the past year at NewsGuard, we are not just reviewing the big Washington publications, but very hyper-local sites, whether it's the patch sites, or there's an interesting something in the East Coast called the Daily Voice that has 70 local editions of, in the suburbs of New York City, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And there's interest in that kind of news. They're talking about, the local Y's, new dance class. There's that kind of community still. It's electronic, and because of technology and economy, it now takes fewer people, but I think there's still interest in that, and it's still alive. It's just in a different way than when I started out.
I wish I had an answer for the decline in local journalists. I think that's something everybody in our industry is concerned about. I'm encouraged every time I see fellowship opportunities come up for journalists to report locally and get outside the bubble. But I think we need more of that. We need more nonprofits willing to fund these journalists, because unfortunately the money's not there, because the demand's not there compared to what you get out of DC and New York. But one more interesting trend that I see in, given the decline in trust in the media among so many Americans, I think you're seeing a desire for readers and listeners and viewers to find those voices that they trust and follow them. They want to feel like they have a relationship with that person. So one product that I'm a part of that I love is called Bright, and it's a morning email for women by women. And every day of the week you get a rundown of news and pop culture and politics and all sorts of fun things by a different female editor, and you know exactly who that is, and you can contact us. And I think people like having that back and forth and having a face to really trust when they get their news, because there is so much distrust in the media right now.
There's I think one of those wonderful pieces of journalism that's been done recently was done, Dan Baltz. And Dan Baltz of the Washington Post covers national politics, and he does it in a lot of the conventional ways that top-notch Washington journalists do. But I think the best thing that he's ever done was when he traveled the country and the reports that he's written from the field, where he talked to voters, and a lot of them that probably didn't vote the way Dan Baltz votes. But he was out there, and it didn't cost a lot to be in the Hampton Inn and get in the rental car and move to the next town. But I think it's the best stuff that he's ever done, and I told him that recently, and when I was talking to him, and he thought, he didn't know if it was the best, but he thought it stretched him in ways, and I think that stretching is what great journalism is about. And here he was, a national reporter out there in the hinterlands, telling stories that wouldn't have been told otherwise. So I think there has to be a mixture of local and national, and I think that interface was really lovely.
So I'd like to open it up to questions from the floor, and maybe can you and I switch, Amy, so I'll walk around with handheld. Questions or comments?
I can talk.
Just so we can catch it on the video here, that'd be great, if you don't mind.
In your opinion, when, being baby boomers of a different generation of many of you, when did the news tend to change into an opinion or this is the way I view the news, telling everybody else, instead of just reporting facts? When do you think that happened? And now it seems it's so rare to just get facts. Like the old detective used to say, just the facts, man, just the facts.
The one thing it is said to be true, and I'm sure it'll be true after this presidency as well, if you asked all American presidents what they felt in common as they left the White House, they'd all say that they hated the press. And that is a great thing for American democracy. We want there to be tension between those branches of life. I think there's just simply been more people in the communication biz, and so there's plenty of facts out there. There's a superfluity of them. There's a lot of people that are making a buck for a while and fewer bucks now, but there's a lot of people pushing messages out there that never were in the broadcasting business before. It used to be Walter Cronkite and Eric Sevareid and one other. And now there's a lot of voices, and that's confusing to all of us. At the same time, there's a lot of information available, and so it puts more demand on us as citizens. That's life changed.
Does this work? Oh yeah, it's I think it's electronic. It's television and social media, and the more information you get and can share, that certainly gave birth to more partisan news. I will say, and after just speaking up for the Associated Press, the world's largest and oldest news gathering organization, we are committed to fact-based, and so many news organizations are, and and at the same time, I know the phrase alternative facts went into mainstream for a while. There are still, I think, as Rod said, the more facts that you have, the more facts that you have, and you will be given more opportunities to interpret a new truth.
I think the public underestimates how much of this trend is user-driven. It's you guys. It's what you're consuming. As much as we all say we don't like cable news, most of you probably watch it. You're giving them money. I don't think we can only blame journalists here. I think it's the public. We want to be entertained as we're being educated. And in a way, I think that's okay. That's why I love documentaries, because I find them entertaining and educating. But there's downsides to that too.
Kelsey, I wanted to ask, is there a handle for Bright? Is it BRIGHT or BRITE, or how do I find it?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So it's you can sign up getbrightemail.com. It's a newsletter run through the Federalist. So you can also go to thefederalist.com, click on their newsletters, and sign up. And newsletters, I think, are a really awesome product that if you aren't signed up for them and you're a news junkie, I imagine you're all interested in news and current events if you cared to come here. I would really encourage you to explore some morning email products. Obviously I'll tout Bright, but Axios is a new one. I think that's more mainstream that I read every morning. If you're sort of into DC politics, Politico Playbook is a really good one. And then, of course, I also work at Daily Signal. We have a morning email called Morning Bell. You can sign up for that on dailysignal.com. But that's what I kind of love. You can find the news organizations that you like and you trust. And most of them have built out products where they can keep you up to date by being more personal and being in your inbox every morning, rather than just relying on what other people are posting on Facebook or Twitter to read.
And I also wanted to agree with y'all about being able to choose those sources of news that you trust. And I think that's why so many of us do skip the middleman and go straight to Twitter, and we can see what the president has to say. Whether you like it or don't, there's no middleman, and that his words haven't been manipulated. You get it straight from the horse's mouth, and that you can trust even if you like it or not.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for coming. I think you touched on it briefly, Kelsey. I'd be curious to kind of get your takes on broadly what you thought of the Covington Catholic situation, just in terms of coverage, because as a young person kind of following that story, it looked to me an awful lot like a public lynching predicated on nothing, just because I looked around, I saw, more of the facts kind of coming out, 24 hours, 48 hours after, and I kind of looked at that and realized it's not profitable to do that. Is it possible to, stay the course that we're on, I guess, journalistically, just as an industry, I guess, just because, just the way that story was covered, it's I think it's obvious to me that, kind of this BuzzFeed style doesn't lend itself to getting it right. It's clickbait style.
Well, I can imagine most of you know what I would think of that. But one of the first headlines that ran about that story was in the New York Times. I wrote it down. Boys in Make America Great Again hats mob Native elder at Indigenous Peoples March. If you click on that headline now, same link. The headline reads, viral video shows boys in Make America Great Again hats surrounding Native elder. I would say that's still pretty misleading. They did post a correction because the original story was from that day when everybody was reporting that it was these high school boys who were at the march in Washington, D.C. for the March for Life, were mobbing this Native American elder, where I'm sure all of you saw it was the exact opposite, where they were being verbally abused, and then the Native American elder approached them and got in their face, and they just stood there. I get curious to get your perspective, Amy, as someone who looks into news sites and ranks them. So they did post a correction, the New York Times, on that. They said an earlier version of this article using information from the Indigenous Peoples Movement gave an incorrect description of Mr. Phillips' military service. Mr. Phillips said in an interview on Sunday and again on Wednesday that he had served during the Vietnam era but was never deployed in South Vietnam. A copy of his record released Wednesday indicates that he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve in 1972 and served until 1976, but is not a Vietnam veteran. So, I think it's important to note that the Vietnam veterans, the Marine Corps veterans, are not the same. They served in the Marine Corps Reserve from 1972 to 1976, but is not a Vietnam veteran. So, I think it's important to note that the Vietnam veterans, the Marine Corps veterans, are not the same. They served in the Marine Corps Reserve from 1972 to 1976, but is not a Vietnam veteran. So there's no disclosure that they changed the headline. There's no way to know what the old headline was unless you wrote it down, took a screenshot. And that's, I think, something that frustrates someone like me who covers the media sometimes, where they change it and they don't tell you. Where's the transparency? I think we all want to forgive them. I don't think the reporters in this case, I think they came in with clear bias, but I'm not going to assume bad motives on them. But I think that it's kind of insulting to their readers to not be transparent about the updates and changes that they had to make. They ended up including a blurb at the beginning saying updates to the story happened. Here's our most recent one, obviously publishing more stories after that. They didn't acknowledge a change in the headline. They didn't acknowledge that so much of the story was still wrong. And this happened, this happens all the time. It happened yet again yesterday with that all that mess happening in Virginia. There was a headline about the Virginia Attorney General that he came out and told everyone that he in his past had worn dark makeup. Wasn't black eyeliner, wasn't the wrong shade of foundation, it was blackface. I'm pretty sure if he were a Republican, it would say blackface. They changed it, no update to changing, telling us they changed the headline. So I think it's really deceptive, and I think you all have difficult jobs because your rankings, I'd be curious to go into that a little bit, how you rank them, because I don't think the mainstream media does a good job in being transparent when they do make changes and corrections.
So the New York Times and most online publications, but the New York Times in particular, I think, updates with a timestamp without announcing every change they made, because news is happening so quickly. In the same way that cable might do that, in the same way that TV might change a headline without saying we had a headline. We're changing this headline because the news breaks as it goes. And several sites publish online corrections, including the New York Times. That the decision on that has to be case by case as to when it merits a correction and when you just have more information to add to give a more nuanced story. Because and that's whatever happened with Covington. It definitely seems that whoever covered all the spectrums that covered it started with less information than they ended up with, and as it developed, it grew to a completely different location. We at NewsGuard have not actually been asked that question, if we should consider changing every single, noting every single change made online. Can you imagine how long that list would be? Who would read it, is what I was initially thinking. But I think we definitely think transparency, and especially publication of corrections, is super important too.
I think that one of the we're all responsible for this too. Because we live in the millisecond now, right? We all want to know everything that happens the minute it happens, and if ideally the minute before it happens, that would be even better. I don't know that I could find an investor, but if I could, I'd try to create a publication called Slow News. It would come out once a week, and it would after all of the stuff that people have been chattering about has filtered out. I guess you'd call it Time Magazine. I don't know, but it'd be a different sort of thing, of where you say, no, we've listened to the right, we've listened to the left. They got it half wrong, they got it half right. Here's our best take on it. What do you think? Anyone want to invest? Slow News.
But I think one of the biggest problems with corrections that we have to acknowledge as an industry as well is that, you're right, we all want to read that story, and this first Covington story probably got 50 times, if not more, the number of clicks than the updated correction version did. And so people go on thinking that's what happened for days, and they don't bother acknowledging the corrections, and the damage is done in a lot of cases.
And different organizations definitely do this differently at some point, and it's not so. I think it's less than 10 years old. The AP decided to print every correction, within the body of the story, so that anytime when you bring it up, at least that will be there for any version of the story, which I think is more common online. But it's several sites will, especially a newspaper, might say, well, it fits in print, I'll correct it. But if not, I might just update it and not really, because they're busy, because they're trying to get it out. So it's just an interesting.
Well, in your defense, I'm not criticizing the AP too often.
No,
I saw two hands, a gentleman in the blue and then the blue behind. Blue one.
I was interested to know. Thank you. I was interested to know how one goes about finding who funds these fact checkers. As an example, Snoops. Who financially funds Snoops? Does anybody know?
Snopes discusses what they disclose on their website, and a lot of it comes from reader donations, and believe I have to now read I should call up our Snopes review right now, but they might have been a nonprofit, but many websites disclose it.
Is George Soros one of the financiers?
No, I don't believe Soros is, no.
So you suggest we go on the website and they'll tell us who's the underlying financial arms of these fact checkers? Is that what you're suggesting?
Often, that's something that NewsGuard has looked at. So, NewsGuard is you're right that's something that's necessary. That NewsGuard is that many people want to know who's behind this, who's financing it, because that impacts information sometimes. And so it's something that's important to know. And many websites disclose it. Many do not. Many don't even say, even name an owner. And you might then have to go through some public records if you were really looking into a particular one.
Thank you.
You maybe elaborate, Amy, since it's come up, what the 9 criteria you look at, NewsGuard looks at?
Sure. And this was sort of created at a table about not much bigger than this, and but mostly by our co-founders came up with 9 different criteria involving credibility, both credibility and how accurate is the information, and transparency, how much are they telling you about what you're getting and how you're getting it. These are weighted in order from top to bottom, and with a point score. The first is, do you repeatedly publish false content? That has to be a no. Do you gather and present information responsibly? That's a little bit, do you have sources? Do you have reporters? Do you in general have any standards for getting information? 3 would be corrections, which we were just talking about. Do you publish them? Do you have a policy for to find errors and to issue the clarifications? Then there is how you use opinion and whether you use it responsibly, and that was one of our more complicated criteria. Are your headlines deceptive? Do they represent what the article says? And then we have the others that are more about transparency. One of them is, do you disclose your ownership, and do you disclose your financing? Do you label your ads? This is not something that everyone always thinks about when they're thinking about the news, but often there's something called sponsored content, where it really looks like a news article, and often it might be written by a company and by an advertiser, and that could confuse you as to whether that is something that the news site is producing or something else. And the last 2 are, do you reveal who's in charge, and do you identify who is creating your content? There are plenty of sites that actually still use pseudonyms or nothing, no byline at all for just a regular story. Those are the 9.
Thank you for being here. So early on in the conversation, maybe it was Rod that mentioned what facts matter to us. And it seems as though there's so much reporting, and you also had mentioned, this feeling of tribalism from the new media, and it seems like there's so much coming out. My question is there a responsibility in journalism or in the overall storytelling that when it goes so quickly, we don't often look at what happens down the road, and it does fuel this tribalism and continues to, from my perspective, maybe dividing us in this way of just like wanting to go with what's hot or what's making money. So is there responsibility, and whose responsibility is that?
I think it's ultimately our responsibility. That's the hard message, I think, to send, because we tend to put so much on journalists. Well, they ought to do a better job. But I think the simple fact of the matter is that all of us as consumers, we've got obligations too. And instead of taking it easy from the same sources that make us feel good, I think my wife is a professional liberal, so she watches MSNBC and CNN, and she's been saying, I watch Fox a lot now because she said it's just so much of the same thing, and that's a healthy instinct on her part. So unfortunately, because there's so much information, so many people out there that are pushing stuff, we have to do that job too. The head of the astronomy department at Harvard has said there's something moving very fast in the heavens, and he thinks it might be from an alien entity. Well, he's the head of the astronomy department at Harvard. It's not going well for him at the moment because the other scientists are saying, come on, man, where are you getting that from? That's what science is about, and they're going to be all over that claim in 1,000 different ways. That's what science does. People make claims and then people check it out. I think we've got to become our own scientists more than we've been in the past. That's our job.
I agree with that, and I would fully acknowledge in the conservative space, without naming names, but there are some conservative news sites, and the same thing on the left, but some that exist more to be provocative. They're more of that like red meat type website. And then I think there's plenty that are in it for the right reasons, not for the clicks, not for the money. I never expected to be working as a journalist at a think tank. I'm in this very weird new media space. Didn't even know that would exist by the time when I was in college. But the reason I've stayed there is because the Heritage Foundation focuses on policy. And so much of what we talk about on cable news and so forth is politics, and those are two different things. And I think when we get past the politics and start talking about policy, we're able to have much more productive conversations and able to see the other side. But I think the bias in the media can be very can make it very difficult to have those conversations. So school safety is an issue that I've covered a lot with all these school shootings that have happened recently. And I'd be curious, does anyone in the room, what do you think of when I say Santa Fe? Most people would say New Mexico. There's a school shooting there. That almost as many students and teachers died as those who died in Parkland. And yet, when we talk about school shootings, in the media, we only talk about Parkland now. Why? Because those students fit the narrative that the media wanted when it comes to gun control. But the issue of school safety isn't about guns, it's about how do we keep schools safe. And taking away guns is having that conversation is preventing us from having the real conversation about physical safety inside schools, mental health, there's so many aspects to this conversation we need to have. And I think the media bias, this is when I say, I've said this before, fake news can have real consequences. And I don't love the term fake news. I was expecting us to get into that a little bit at some point. But I think we have to acknowledge that it exists and it does have consequences, especially for that student at Covington, that he has to live with his name smeared for the rest of his life. And imagine how traumatizing that would be, by the way, to have your face out there. I think it's really awful. But yeah, I would say there are some of us who are in this industry who want to talk about policies and are optimistic. I see it as a glass half full when I do have more conversations about policy instead of politics. I'm able to get further and we're able to talk about solutions. But it can be hard to bridge that gap, especially when there's a demand for the politics.
If I could make any money with my slow news thing, and if I made enough, I would create an annual award, the Chris Wallace Award, for all the journalists who suddenly break through and report and comment on something that runs counter to the hegemony of the news organization which I work. So I would challenge you to see whether or not you would get any Chris Wallace awards. Do you break through? Does your brand control you? I think that's the challenge for any positioned news organization, whether it's conservative or liberal. How many times do you break through and do things that the boss doesn't countenance?
That's interesting. I just. There's more information than ever, and yet it's more challenging than ever to actually be informed, because you almost have to work harder at it if you have dozens of sources telling you different things about the exact same event, and that's when say NewsGuard was just trying to stick with facts and not. It's to the best of our ability, even though everyone, of course, has an opinion about everything, trying to not be partisan and just to look at hard facts as much as we can, and see, and not penalize people for having points of view necessarily. It's okay. It's okay to get your information with a point of view as long as it's delivered in a certain way with true facts, and as long as you're sort of disclosing it, owning it. This is what I think, and this is why, and we need to talk about it. It's just there's so many more sources now, and it's work. You're right. It's work to do it.
I feel all badly for the Covington kid. He entered the public sphere. He went to Washington, D.C., all of his friends, they all went to a place where people have public dialogue. You enter the public sphere, you take what happens, and you lose control, a lot of it. And people look at you, they make interpretations of your behavior. And I'm not saying there weren't problems with the story, but he entered the public sphere. Nobody went to his high school and caught him behind the gym locker and took a picture of him and put it on the national news. He entered the public sphere, maybe ill-advisedly or something, but that's a tough place to be. And he voluntarily went in there, and you lose certain prerogatives when you do that, I believe.
But he never would have been even hardly worthy of a news story had the media not botched their job. Nobody would know his name.
Maybe.
That's one of those stories where I feel like I don't have the whole story, and I don't really.
There's a whole 2-hour video.
I feel like I don't, and I'll never know it until we start from the beginning, and it'll be at a place that I never was at.
Thank you.
They know the story because they have lawsuits going now. So when we get into that, maybe we will know truth.
So I have a question on the subject that haven't been touched yet. There was a mentioning that there is a growing distrust in conventional mass media, and that people tend to trust more of a face behind the actual news source. And with that in mind, a lot of people looking at digital sources like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook as their news source. However, most of these sources have pretty strict community guidelines, and they based their moderation, or how I can call them, censorship, based on these guidelines. And I think Kelsey might be closer to this subject, because most of these companies leaning towards liberal views. And my main question is, what do you think of the growing level of censorships on those platforms?
I think it's alarming, but I think it's important not to jump to conclusions when you hear a story of someone being censored. So much of this censorship is happening by robots now. And as soon as you're censored, you have a chance to appeal it. And in a lot of the cases that I've seen, the appeals have been overruled when a human gets involved. That doesn't mean it's any less frustrating that it's always the conservatives getting censored and not the liberals. Very frustrating. But I have been encouraged that the Heritage Foundation and the Daily Signal has been able to forge good relationships with Facebook, and we haven't had too much problems on that front. And I fully acknowledge there are some cases where conservatives are putting out offensive content or problematic content that does violate their community guidelines. We all complain about it, but nobody actually reads their community guidelines. But that said, I think when you get to the nitty-gritty, it's the story's not over yet, because with the issue of gender pronouns, if they decide that it's discriminatory and they're not going to host content, where we're going to have this conversation about this relatively new topic in our public space, that's going to be a problem, because this is an issue people care about and people want to talk about. So, I say that I think there is a problem, but I would encourage you all not to be like the journalist who jumped on the Covington story and overreact before waiting to see the whole story and find out why they did censor that content.
I just want to jump in that these platforms are not, Facebook has started to censor or block some accounts, but for the most part, these are the YouTubes and the Reddits and Wikipedia, for that matter, are just unvetted sources of information where you don't know what you're going to get from one thing to the next. So those are not always. Meaning when you have a platform where anyone can, where you can put it, we all can put on our own show. There's some guidelines, but it's not. Those are sources that we would not know how to rate, for instance, in what we're doing, because there's so many differences. And you're right, censorship is not the answer. The last part.
It's hard, though, because I know so many conservatives are frustrated about this issue. I don't want to downplay it. It's something we are all talking about and watching very closely. That said, I think it's our choice to use these platforms. And I feel, we feel very beholden to them, because so much of that dictates whether our content is seen and heard. But it's not, our right to use them. It's our privilege. And I guess this is where the policy aspect is coming in, where I would be very hesitant to encourage the government to be, regulating these platforms. Instead, I would like to see all of us pushing back and making our voices heard when there are unfair cases of censorship, which right now I think we're doing a pretty good job doing. I feel like in most cases that are where we are unfairly censored, we create enough of a outcry about it that they eventually push back.
Thank you all for being here. My question is this: when I was in journalism courses back in college, they used to teach you who, what, where, when, and why. you verified by 2 or 3 sources, and then you ran with it. And today, especially in the newspaper, the editorial's on the front page, not where it should be in the editorial section. So my question to you is, and especially to the comment about newspapers, I used to get the Daily Camera, the Denver Post. I don't anymore because they don't have the facts. They have opinion on the front page. Can you speak to that?
I don't know that that's a universal truth. I don't know the local situation. There's, I don't think I can say anything broadly about that. There's a lot of news being reported by really hardworking reporters all across the country at all the time. Opinions on the front page, as opposed to the opinion page, yeah. Yeah, not a decision I would have encouraged, because it feeds to the impression that that you got. But I don't think of that as a popular option at the moment. I don't know why it got there in Denver.
I mean, I haven't read both papers recently, but I've seen news. News in general on the sites, and I think there are a lot of different choices websites and organizations are making about how to label what is an opinion is. Sometimes if it's a columnist, maybe I've just seen the name, or the name and then the colon, and that might be the way they would connote opinion. Some people say analysis and perspective, and I think that is that there are different choices that might not make it very clear to a user about what you're looking at, because that's what you want to know. Are you looking at somebody's particular point of view, or are you looking at an objectively reported piece?
Especially given the furor about the topics that we're talking about tonight, it would be the very worst time, in my opinion, to put the opinion on the front page. That seems really unwise.
Not going to be able to get to everybody, but this gentleman's been waiting patiently.
Oh, I'm one of those people who still takes that skinny Daily Camera, and then I have to point out to some of my friends that it takes me a long time to read it because it's so full of news and opinion and facts and so forth, and it's contentious. And the news that you could have an opinion on the front page. CDOT is not giving Boulder what we need. On a state highway, things like that, not providing the proper transportation system we need. An article would be there about what the whole meeting was about and what they did and all, and you get the facts. And but they get a lot of interesting opinion letters in the newspaper. It takes time to look at them, and you think about the time that some of those people spent writing those opinions. It's amazing. On another subject, I went to Miami Beach a long time ago, and there was a museum there, a museum showing propaganda, art, and crafts, arts and crafts that were developed to promote propaganda. And it was an amazing museum. Does anyone know that museum is still there at Miami Beach? That's when I first heard the name, and it was 40 years ago at least. George Soros has financed that museum, and it was a wonderful arts and crafts museum, and it amazed me, and it was free.
I'm not sure either. Thank you for that. And we're just about at 7 when we promised we'd let you out. It doesn't mean the conversation's over. We've got some snacks outside, and we'd love to continue it, and the panelists will be out. But what a wonderful opportunity to hear these folks, if we could give it up for them. And I guess just one sort of closing observation in the spirit of considering things from all different perspectives, and it's been nice to have a range of voices in the room here. And I think that back to Rod's original point that everybody's entitled to their own facts, I mean, I'd say a couple of things maybe. That one person's opinion is another person's facts. One person's truth is another person's bias. In a world where there is too much information and too many sites, maybe the thing isn't to listen to news that we trust. Maybe it's to listen and read more news that we don't trust, because attention is something we all have limited supplies of. And the guys in the MAGA hats in Kentucky, that's a really terrible thing for a lot of people that happened. And for a lot of other people, it's a really terrible thing that people questioned Barack Obama's birthplace. And so maybe what we need more of is considering what really bothers other people and doesn't bother us, not necessarily as a way to get at an absolute truth, but to realize the variety of truths that we have here. And so I think it's wonderful that Kelsey is a critic of the media from the right. That didn't hardly exist a few years ago. But it also strikes me that if we're going to be critical of some media, is it in the name of our own ideology, or is it in the name of hoping for truth and understanding? And I'm not saying one way or another for you, but just food for thought in this really nice pluralistic space. And thanks everybody again for coming out on such a cold night, and let's continue the conversation in the hall. Thank you.